Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It's a huge year for elections around the world, with nearly half of the global population voting in 2024. India, Indonesia, Iran, France, the UK, the European Parliament, they've had elections already. Of course, we've got the US presidential election coming up in November. It all has a significant impact on financial markets and investors. Niall O'Sullivan is the Global Solutions Chief Investment Officer at investment giant Mercer. He's normally based in London, but he's out here for the Mercer Global Investment Forum. Remember, this is general information only. You should always seek professional advice before making investment decisions. Niall O'Sullivan, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
Tell me, this year, have you ever seen a year like this with so much political activity and change?
Well, it's probably, I'm not sure anyone has. I think over 50% of the global population is voting over the course of the year in multiple places. And clearly there's a lot going on, but there's probably a few underlying trends that are quite interesting as well that we'll be able to have seen through multiple elections, what has happened and what is going to happen from here.
Okay, so let's jump right into that now. There's a shift to the right in some places, but then a shift to the left in others. And then if you're France, you sort of go right and then you go left. Can we bring out some of these trends coming through? Because, I mean, ultimately we want to know what's it mean for investing. But what are some of the things you are seeing across these elections?
So I think what's really interesting, and you nailed it in your comment, is kind of why is it going either way? And to some extent, what you're seeing is the impact of inflation. So inflation has come through, and obviously financial commentators are talking about the fact that it's under control and it's come back down. But if you've had an increase in prices of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%, depending where you are, just because it's increasing at maybe 2.5% this year, you still have that lived experience of the 8 or 9% affecting you. So one of the trends when you kind of look through is it's usually the incumbent that is effectively being punished in the various elections. So in a lot of cases, what you're seeing is the party that was in power is losing, whether it was on the left, whether it was on the right, it is losing as a result of that, because you've had, instances like Poland where it would have swung from one side to the other, compared to other instances where the incumbent party has been punished. So I think that that's kind of one of the major trends. It's how inflation plays out and what it means as a result. I think the second thing that you would add to that is, yes, on either side of the extremes of politics, you are seeing an increase in the vote there. But increasingly, you're still seeing in most places a kind of between centre left and centre right, still the centre to a large extent is holding. So there's an increase in what's going on at the extremes, but at the centre it is holding. I think the third thing then is, as you say, what does that mean? What's interesting is that kind of across the board, you're not really seeing anybody suggesting that it's time to become fiscally more responsible. Generally speaking, you're continuing to see deficit spending, and we will probably talk about the US in a few minutes as well. But effectively, if you look at the underlying policies that governments are pursuing, it's not obvious that there will be massive shifts as a result of these elections going on. And so it may be that there will not be enormous shifts in the policies coming through on the economic side as a result. And indeed, generally speaking, absent some sort of existential shock, elections don't tend to have a massive impact on markets other than in and around the election when uncertainty is removed. It usually tends to be good for the markets in the short term.
Okay, so let's go on to the US election. I suppose reading through what you've just said, Niall, you can argue that we need to get through the next 6-month period until less than that now, until November, to get the election over and done with. And they don't tend to move markets a lot. When you have such a stark choice, I suppose, as you do in the US, is it any different, or is it just a period we need to get through and then work with whoever the winners is, their policies and their trade views and their spending views, etc.?
So I think if we divide it into the economic issues and the social issues, I think there are obviously some stark choices coming through on maybe that more social side of things. But if we were to look at the economic side of things, and back to that point about the, say, deficit spending as an example, it's not like one side is suggesting that we should become much more fiscally responsible than the other. It's not like one side is suggesting we should be doing something dramatically different in terms of fiscal spending or fiscal deficits compared to the other. So to an extent, that model of relatively large deficits and continuing to power that goes through is unlikely to be all that different on either side. I think the Federal Reserve continues to do what it's doing irrespective of the result. I think that, when you talk about kind of broader trade and maybe the noise around, tariffs and the things that come with it, there's clearly a risk of some escalation in global trade as part of that. But to be fair, the incumbent administration is also facing a lot in terms of global trade and looking at areas like EVs and the like in terms of what's happening. So I think the choice on the economic side may not be all that different, though there could be a lot of saber rattling and noise between here and there.
Stay with me, Niall. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Niall O'Sullivan from Mercer. What about India and emerging markets generally, but particularly India? Narendra Modi was returned to power. India has an interesting place in the world because it's kind of comfortable with the East and the West. Also, a massive economy that's growing fast. I mean, I suppose, how do you see India as a player in the global economy? And then kind of the question after that, how do you play that in an investment sense?
So I think if you were to look at India generally and linking all of the themes we just talked about together, he was returned, but he was returned at less of a majority than he had before. And again, I think representative of that general trend around incumbency not being a major positive in elections. If you take the second part of what you're saying, yes, in the period where you can be friendly with either side of a discussion, it's probably a good thing. And you're seeing that coming true. The economy is continuing to power forward, and we expect it to continue to power forward. I suppose from an equity point of view, though, it needs to, because the valuations that they're at are richer than they have been in the past. And when you have richer valuations, that's okay, but you need to grow into those valuations. In our portfolios, broadly speaking, we would be positioned for an overweight to emerging markets relative to developed markets coming through from here, but not specifically heavier in India compared to other regions, because while we think the growth story, as you outlined, is very positive, we would be somewhat wary of the valuations that are coming alongside it. But that general point about the emerging markets and other countries like India who are positioned to maybe do well in some of these in heightened geopolitical tensions, we are positioning our portfolios to be overweight them relative to some of the developed markets.
Niall, you can't be in Australia and not expect me to ask you about China, because a lot of Australia's wealth is dependent on China. What's your view there, particularly with the fact that Beijing thus far has been reticent to put too much money to get economic growth kind of back to those 5, 6, 7% levels that they used to have?
Yeah, and we're looking at this. You're seeing a big bifurcation in the growth coming out of China. So as you say, at an overall level, the growth is still coming into the lower end of those ranges, hovering just either side of 5, depending on the recent numbers that are being published. But if you look at the growth inside that, it's very much driven by the export side of things, very much driven by the kind of the trade side of things, and not being driven by the consumer-led side. The third plenum has obviously not given any particular guidance that there's going to be any more increases or any improvements there. I think what we would say is that they're probably, to an extent, doing the least that they can do to keep things going along from a financial robustness point of view. So they are putting in place measures to insulate parts of the property system, insulate parts of the people that are there, but not necessarily doing things to lead to turbocharged growth. And I think that's possibly the policy that they are relatively happy with, to rely on the global trade side of things and to get effectively that to achieve the growth and not go for any massive stimulus on the property side or the consumer side. What that means at an overall level is that, when we approach investment decisions, we would look at the fundamentals, the valuations and the technicals. The fundamentals in a context like that are okay. Like, in either side of 5%, the growth is quite good. The valuations are clearly a lot more favorable than they were before. If you look at where you're looking at the kind of price earnings or weights and indices or other things like that. But the technicals from a market point of view have been a problem. It has been an area where there's not been a lot of positive sentiment from investors globally. So back to that point, we are continuing to be overweight the emerging markets. but we're not being any way particularly disposed positively or negative to China relative to that weight. The thinking being that while the fundamentals are positive, the valuations are positive, but the technicals remain a risk. And there's not an obvious catalyst for that to change. And so just a general overweight to emerging markets seems to make sense to us.
Okay, I want to bring this discussion the full circle. We started off, I asked you about why there has been so much going on, and you put it down to inflation was the first thing you talked about. And we talked about the impact inflation has had on shifts to the right and left and incumbency and stuff like that. If we get, so 2024 will be the year of elections and the year of inflation, or the end of inflation at least. If we get back to more normal inflation, whatever that is, but we're talking 2-3% range, does that settle things down a bit? So on the political sphere, do you think that once people are used to 2-3% inflation, assuming we get there, things do settle down a bit?
The political sphere, I think it takes quite a while actually for an impact of 7-8-9% inflation, whatever it is, to drop out of the consumer experience, because you're just seeing the prices staying higher for a period of time. It takes a long time to get used to. So I actually think that will probably lead to noise in the system for quite a while. There will be, people talking about a cost of living crisis and experiencing a cost of living crisis. Like we were just talking about it yesterday for, say, in Australia, for many super members. Yes, their investment pots have had a great year in terms of investment returns, but on a day-to-day basis, when they go to the shops, they see things higher than they used to be. And that's not going to stop. It may stabilize, but it's still going to be higher than the thing they're used to. So I think that noise will stay in the system for a while. In terms of the reaction function of central banks, though, yes, if inflation gets back to those kind of steady levels that they are looking for, then that will give them the space to start easing. So you've seen the European Central Bank, the UK Central Bank already make their first cut, but be then very measured about what they will do next. The Fed, I think we will see over the next year, if things stay as they are, particularly at the most recent weak inflation print, I think they'll be in a position to then start easing also. And so I think returning to a kind of a slightly lower level of interest rates, a more normal level of real yields, is how we would see it. We think the thing that will enable that to happen in the US is the labor market is getting looser, but not as in more people are available to be employed, but not because necessarily people are being laid off, but because there's been an increase in people in the labor market to an extent driven by immigration. So in those contexts, you can get the type of soft landing that people are hoping for. So I think on the economic side, the rate side, you should be in a world where inflation comes back to those more stable levels, with central banks heading to more normal levels. And in and of itself, that is something that leads to markets that are relatively stable. How we're putting that into our portfolios on an ongoing basis is we have at the margin an overweight to equities generally, but as I said earlier, probably favoring some of the more emerging markets areas, an allocation to Japan against developed markets in that context.
Niall, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much.
That was Niall O'Sullivan, Global Solutions Chief Investment Officer at Mercer. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Remember, this is general information only, and you should seek professional advice before making investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.